Up in the hollers of Kentucky, West Virginia, and East Tennessee, there was a kind of cooking nobody ever wrote down in a cookbook. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't meant to impress a soul. It was the food an elderly widow made for herself after the chickens were fed, the fire was banked, and the house had gone quiet again. 10 minutes, 1 pot, whatever was left in the cellar or the flour bin. That was supper. 30 of those meals are still remembered by the people who ate them. And by the time you get to the last one, you'll understand why some of them were never spoken about outside the family. Stay with this one all the way through, because meal number 17 is the one most people say they haven't thought about in 50 years, and the last 5 will explain exactly why these recipes went silent in the first place. There's a QR code on your screen right now, and it'll stay there the whole way through this video. If any of this feels like it belongs to your own family's kitchen, scan it and subscribe before we start, so you don't lose your way back here. Let's start with the one almost everyone in these mountains grew up eating, whether they had a nickel or not. 1. Soup beans and cornbread. Ask anyone raised in Appalachia what supper meant, and this is the answer 9 times out of 10. A pot of pinto beans, cooked down soft in their own broth, ladled hot over a wedge of skillet cornbread still steaming from the oven. An elderly woman living by herself in the 1960s kept a jar of dried pintos in the pantry and a bag of cornmeal beside the stove, because between the two, she was never more than 10 minutes from a hot meal, as long as the beans had already been soaked. A spoonful of bacon grease stirred through the pot gave it body. A splash of vinegar or a few slices of raw onion on top cut the richness. The smell alone, smoky, earthy, faintly sweet from the corn, was enough to pull a person back to a table from 40 years earlier. It cost pennies. It filled the stomach for hours, and it asked for nothing but a spoon and a little patience. But cornbread wasn't only a companion to beans. Sometimes it stood entirely on its own, in a form most people outside these hills have never even heard of. 2. Cornbread and buttermilk crumble, a thick slab of day-old cornbread into a tall glass. Pour cold buttermilk over the top until it rises to the rim. Eat it with a spoon, straight from the glass, standing at the kitchen counter or sitting on the porch step as the sun went down. That was it. That was the whole meal. The tang of the buttermilk against the crumbly sweetness of the corn created something between a soup and a dessert. And for a woman living alone with no appetite for anything heavier, it went down easy and sat gently in the stomach. It required no stove, no pan, no waiting. Just a glass, a spoon, and whatever was left of the morning's cornbread. It was the kind of supper nobody bragged about making, but almost everybody who grew up poor in these mountains remembers exactly how it tasted. Now, if a person had a little more energy that evening, there was a version of eggs that only made sense once the garden tomatoes came in. 3. Tomato gravy. Over biscuits, this one turned a handful of overripe tomatoes into something close to a feast. Chopped tomatoes went into a hot skillet with a spoonful of bacon grease, a sprinkle of flour to thicken it, and a splash of milk to smooth it out into a rosy, slightly tangy gravy. Poured over a split leftover biscuit, it turned stale bread into something worth sitting down for. The smell of tomatoes cooking down in fat filled the whole kitchen, sharp and a little sweet. For a woman whose garden had given her more tomatoes than she could ever eat fresh, this was how nothing went to waste. It took less than 10 minutes, dirtied 1 skillet, and tasted like late summer even in the dead of winter, when the last jar of canned tomatoes finally got opened. That same skillet of hot grease had another use, one that turned breakfast food into supper without anyone thinking twice about it. 4. Fried mush with sorghum cornmeal mush, cooked thick the night before and left to firm up in a loaf pan. Got sliced into half-inch rounds and fried in butter or bacon fat until the edges turned dark and crisp. Drizzled with sorghum molasses instead of syrup, it had a deep, almost bitter sweetness that maple syrup never had. The outside crackled. the inside stayed soft and warm. An elderly man or woman living alone could make an entire loaf on a Sunday and fry off a few slices every evening that week, meaning most of the work was already done before the real hunger set in. It was cheap, it kept for days in the icebox, and it turned a 5-cent bag of cornmeal into supper 5 nights running. But not every quick supper started with something already made. Some of them started with whatever was still growing wild outside the back door. 5. Wilted poke salad with bacon grease. Every spring, before the poke plant grew tall enough to turn dangerous, folks in these hills gathered the young, tender leaves growing wild along fence rows and ditch banks. Boiled twice to draw out the bitterness, drained well, then wilted quickly in a hot skillet with bacon grease and a few crumbled bits of bacon, poke salad tasted something like spinach crossed with a wild mineral edge you couldn't get from anything store-bought. It cost nothing but the walk to go pick it. For a woman who'd grown up gathering greens with her own mother, cooking poke salad alone in her 70s wasn't just supper. It was a small, private conversation with everyone who'd taught her how to find it, how to boil it twice, and how much was safe to eat. If poke was too particular a taste, there was a gentler wild green that most people actually preferred. 6. Creasy greens with hot bacon dressing. Creasy greens, a peppery little green that grows wild along mountain streams in the earliest weeks of spring, got washed, torn, and piled raw into a bowl. Hot bacon grease, poured straight from the skillet along with a splash of vinegar, wilted the leaves on contact, turning them tender and glossy in seconds. The dressing sizzled when it hit the greens, and the whole kitchen filled with the smell of vinegar and hot fat. It was sharp, peppery, and a little bit smoky. And it was ready before the bacon grease even had time to cool. For a woman living alone, this was one of the few meals of the year that felt like a genuine treat rather than a necessity. Because creasy greens only lasted a few short weeks before the season passed. Not every supper came from the woods, though. Some came from a jar that had been sitting in the cellar since last September. 7. Leather breeches beans. Before anyone owned a freezer, green beans were strung on thread and hung to dry along the porch rafters every summer, turning into what everyone called leather breeches. Come winter, a handful got soaked overnight, then simmered low with a chunk of fatback or a ham hock until they went soft and dark, tasting nothing like a fresh green bean and everything like something entirely its own. Smoky, dense, almost meaty. A woman living alone in January could pull down a string of dried beans that had been hanging since July and turn them into supper with almost no effort at all, because the hard work had been done months earlier, back when the garden was still producing more than one person could ever eat. There was another way to stretch a summer garden clear through the winter, and it didn't require a single pot on the stove. 8. Chow chow on crackers. Chow chow, a relish of chopped cabbage, green tomatoes, peppers, and onions, put up in vinegar and sugar back in September, got spooned straight from the jar onto a plate of saltine crackers for a supper that needed no cooking at all. Sweet, sour, and crunchy all at once, it woke up a tired appetite on the nights when standing at a stove felt like more than a person had in them. One jar, opened once and kept in the icebox, could feed a woman alone for the better part of 2 weeks. It was proof that the real work of an Appalachian supper often happened months before the meal itself. Back in canning season, when a woman's whole kitchen table was covered in mason jars, and the real cooking, the cooking that mattered, was already finished before winter ever arrived. But sometimes there was no jar left, no garden, and no green thing growing anywhere nearby. Those nights called for something that came from the flour bin instead. 9. Cathead biscuits and molasses. Named for their size, big and rough-shaped as a cat's head, these biscuits were mixed fast, with cold lard cut into flour and just enough buttermilk to bring it together, then baked hot and quick. Split open while they were still steaming, with a well pressed into the center and sorghum molasses poured in to pool. This was supper for a woman who had flour, lard, and buttermilk in the house and little else. The biscuit itself was the whole meal. Dense, slightly sour from the buttermilk, with a crisp golden crust giving way to a soft, almost doughy center. It took 10 minutes from bowl to table, dirtied 1 pan, and turned 3 cheap ingredients into something that tasted, against all odds, like comfort. Biscuits made another appearance too, but this time they came with a gravy that turned a handful of leftover meat scraps into something that felt like a real dinner. 10. Sawmill gravy over biscuits, a few tablespoons of sausage grease, a sprinkle of flour, and a slow pour of milk, whisked over medium heat until it thickened into a peppery white gravy, studded with whatever crumbled sausage or bits of bacon happened to be left in the pan. Poured generously over split biscuits, this was heavy, filling, and unapologetically simple. The pepper had to be generous. That sharp black bite was what separated real sawmill gravy from a bland white sauce. And every woman who made it had her own opinion about exactly how much was enough. For a widow eating alone, a single pan of gravy could stretch across 2 or 3 suppers, reheated each time with a splash more milk to loosen it back up. Not every gravy started with sausage, though. Some started with nothing but an egg and a hot skillet. 11. Egg gravy on toast. Whisked eggs, poured slowly into a skillet of hot bacon grease and milk, cooked down into soft curds suspended in a thin, savory gravy, then spooned over torn pieces of toasted white bread. It was somewhere between scrambled eggs and a sauce, delicate and mild, the kind of supper a woman made on nights when her appetite was small, but her body still needed something warm in it. The whole thing came together in the same skillet the bacon had been fried in that morning, using grease that had been sitting on the back of the stove all day, waiting to become supper. Nothing wasted, nothing wanting for more than 5 minutes of attention. If eggs and gravy felt too thin, there was a heartier version of eggs that turned breakfast into something that could carry a person clear through to morning. 12. Fried bologna and eggs, thick-cut bologna, scored around the edges so it wouldn't curl and cup in the pan, fried in its own fat until the edges went dark and crisp, with an egg cracked right into the same skillet once the meat came out. The egg cooked in bologna grease, edges lacy and brown, yolk still soft in the center. Stacked together on a slice of white bread, it was salty, rich, and unmistakably a mountain supper, the kind of meal that shows up in nearly every account of growing up poor in these hills, because bologna was cheap, it didn't spoil fast, and a single roll of it could feed a woman alone for a week of suppers, 1 or 2 slices at a time. There was another cut of meat, even cheaper than bologna, that most younger folks today have never even tasted. 13. Fried fatback with milk gravy. Fatback, the fat trimmed from the side of a hog, salted and cured, got sliced thin and fried in its own rendered fat until the pieces curled and crackled like bacon, but richer, heavier, almost entirely fat with barely a streak of meat running through it. The drippings left behind in the pan became gravy, milk whisked in and simmered until thick, poured over the crispy fatback and a biscuit alongside. It was not a delicate meal. It was calories, plain and simple, built for a body that had worked outside all day and needed fuel more than flavor. For an elderly woman still living the way she'd always lived, fatback was what her own mother had fed the family through the leanest winters, and making it for herself, alone, decades later, was less a recipe than a memory she could still taste. Sometimes, though, there wasn't fatback in the house at all, only whatever had been canned or preserved the previous fall, sitting quietly on a cellar shelf. 14. Soupy taters, diced potatoes, boiled soft in just enough water to cover them, then finished with a splash of milk, a pat of butter, and enough black pepper to make your nose run. This was less a potato dish than a potato soup. Thin and simple, the kind of thing a woman made when she wanted something warm but didn't have much left in the house to put in it. Some families added a spoonful of flour to thicken it further. Others left it thin and drank it as much as ate it, sopping up the last of the broth with a torn piece of cornbread. It cost almost nothing, took less than 10 minutes once the potatoes were peeled, and tasted, more than anything, like being taken care of, even when there was no one left to do the taking care. There was a version of this same idea, but built around beans instead of potatoes, that stretched even further across a hard winter. 15. Pinto bean soup, with onion leftover soup beans, thinned with a little extra water or broth, and simmered again with a handful of chopped raw onion stirred in at the very end, turned yesterday's supper into tonight's without a single new ingredient. The raw onion, added last, kept its bite and crunch against the soft, creamy beans, and that contrast, hot and cold, soft and sharp, was what kept the second-day version from feeling like leftovers at all. A woman living alone learned early that a big pot of beans wasn't one supper. It was 4 or 5, each one a little different depending on what got stirred in, and each one asking for almost no work at all beyond a match and a burner. Before we go any further, take a second and look at that QR code sitting in the corner of your screen. It's been there since we started, and it'll stay there until the end. Scanning it and subscribing costs you nothing, and it means the next batch of forgotten kitchen stories finds its way to you without you having to go looking for it. Not every meal built on leftovers, though. Some were built entirely from what a person could gather from a single trip out to the garden gate. 16. Killed lettuce with hot grease. The earliest lettuce of spring, torn into a bowl while still cool from the garden, doused with hot bacon grease and a splash of vinegar poured straight from the skillet. The lettuce wilted almost instantly, turning soft and glossy, the leaves darkening at the edges where the hot fat touched them first. A little sugar stirred into the drippings balanced the vinegar's sharpness. It was called killed lettuce because that's exactly what the hot grease did to it, and for a woman who'd planted that lettuce herself back in March, eating it this way in April was the first real taste of the growing season, after a long winter of nothing but jars and dried goods. There is one meal, though, that almost nobody talks about anymore. The one that people who lived through it still go quiet when they remember. 17. Milk toast for the sick and the silent. Toasted white bread, buttered while hot, torn into pieces, and covered in warm milk until it went soft and swollen, sometimes with a little sugar stirred in, sometimes with nothing at all. This was the meal made for a body that couldn't handle much else. After a bad spell, after a long illness, after a fall that left a woman too shaken to stand at the stove for longer than it took to warm a pan of milk. It wasn't meant to taste like much. It was meant to go down easy and sit gently. And for generations of Appalachian families, it was passed from mother to child not as a recipe, but as an act of tending, something you made for someone who needed softening, someone who needed care. Making it alone, for yourself, with no one there to bring the bowl to your bedside, was a different thing entirely. It was the same gesture, turned inward, with nobody on the other end of it. People who ate it as children remember their mother's hands. People who made it for themselves in old age remember the empty kitchen instead. If milk toast was the softest meal in these hills, the next one was its opposite. Sharp, salty, and built to wake a tired appetite right back up. 18. Liver mush on white bread, a regional specialty found across the Appalachian foothills. Liver mush, pork liver and cornmeal, seasoned heavy with sage and pepper, formed into a loaf and chilled until firm, got sliced thick and fried until the edges crisped dark, and the inside stayed soft. Laid on a slice of soft white bread with a smear of mustard, it was intense, mineral, peppery, and utterly unlike anything found outside these particular hills and hollers. A single loaf, bought or made at hog-killing time in the fall, could be sliced off in portions across weeks of suppers, wrapped tight and kept in the coldest corner of the icebox. For a woman who'd grown up around hog-killing, the smell of liver mush frying in a skillet wasn't strange at all. It smelled like home and like a season of the year most people alive today never witnessed. Meat wasn't always fried, though. Sometimes it was simmered down into something that used every last part of the hog, right down to the ears and feet. 19. Souse meat and crackers. Souse, sometimes called head cheese, was made from the scraps of a hog, head, feet, and trimmings, simmered for hours until the meat fell apart and the broth turned rich with natural gelatin, then packed into a loaf pan and chilled until it set firm enough to slice. Cut thin and served cold on saltine crackers with a dab of hot sauce or vinegar, it had a texture unlike anything else on this list, tender and slightly wobbly, closer to a terrine than anything most people today would call meat. It wasn't made in 10 minutes. The boiling took most of a day. But once it was set in the icebox, an elderly woman living alone could slice off a portion for supper in under 2, night after night, for as long as the loaf lasted. It was proof that nothing on a hog went to waste, not in a household where waste simply wasn't an option. Beans and meat scraps weren't the only things simmered low and slow. Sometimes it was nothing but water, a bone, and whatever the garden hadn't quite used up. 20. Hominy fried in bacon grease. Canned or home-processed hominy, corn kernels treated until they swelled soft and slightly chewy, got drained and fried hard in bacon grease, until the edges turned golden and a little crisp, finished with black pepper and sometimes a sprinkle of sugar to balance the corn's natural starchiness. It sounds plain on paper, but the texture told a different story. Crisp outside, tender and almost creamy within, with a flavor that landed somewhere between corn and potato. A can of hominy, kept in the pantry alongside the beans, was insurance against a night with nothing fresh in the house. 10 minutes, 1 skillet, and a woman had supper, no matter what the weather outside had done to the garden that week. There's one more meat dish that deserves mentioning before we move into the last stretch, a dish built entirely around getting the most out of the cheapest cut a butcher would sell. 21. Streaked meat and gravy. Streaked meat, a cheap, heavily fatty cut of pork, streaked through with just enough lean meat to call it more than pure fat, got sliced and fried until crisp, the drippings turned into a peppery gravy, the same way sawmill gravy was made, then poured back over the meat itself or over a split biscuit alongside it. It was salty, rich, and heavy in a way that filled a person up fast, which was exactly the point. Streaked meat was some of the cheapest protein a butcher sold, and a small package could be portioned into a week's worth of suppers, a slice or two fried up each evening alongside whatever vegetable happened to be on hand. Sometimes, though, there wasn't meat in the house at all, not even the cheapest cut. On those nights, supper came down to nothing but eggs and whatever was left of yesterday's cornbread. 22. Cornbread and sweet milk with a fried egg. A wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, sweet milk poured over the top, and a single fried egg laid on the side. This odd little combination showed up across mountain kitchens as a way to stretch a meal that was, technically, only 2 ingredients deep. The egg added protein the cornbread and milk alone couldn't provide, and eating it required no real plan, no shopping trip, nothing but what was already sitting in the kitchen from days earlier. It wasn't a meal anyone would have described as good. It was a meal a person made because it was there, because the stove was already warm, and because 10 more minutes of hunger felt worse than eating something plain. There was a version of eggs that leaned sweet instead of savory, and it showed up most often on the hardest nights of all. 23. Apple butter on biscuit apple butter, cooked down over an entire day each fall from a bushel of orchard apples, cinnamon, and sugar, until it turned thick, dark, and spreadable, got kept in mason jars in the cellar, and spooned generously onto a warm biscuit for supper on nights when nothing savory sounded appealing at all. It was sweet, spiced, and deeply comforting, tasting like the one day each year the whole family gathered to stir a copper kettle over an open fire. Eating a spoonful of that same apple butter alone, decades later, on a biscuit made just for one, carried all of that memory forward into a kitchen that had otherwise gone quiet. Sweetness had its place at supper more than once, and there was another version built entirely around a single, humble sweet potato. 24. Baked sweet potato with butter and sorghum. A single sweet potato, pierced with a fork, and either baked in a hot oven or, more often for a quick supper, boiled whole until soft, split open, and mashed right in its own skin with a pat of butter and a drizzle of sorghum. It was naturally sweet, dense, and filling all on its own, needing nothing else on the plate to feel like a complete meal. For a woman with a root cellar full of sweet potatoes harvested back in October, this was supper she could make blind, in the dark, by memory alone, night after night through the coldest months, without ever once running low. Root vegetables carried a household a long way, but there was one dish that combined nearly everything left in the cellar into a single pot. 25. Cellar vegetable soup. Whatever remained in the root cellar by late winter, a shriveling carrot, half an onion, a few potatoes gone slightly soft, got chopped and simmered together in water with a spoonful of bacon grease and whatever seasoning was on hand, cooked down until the vegetables went tender and the broth took on their combined flavor. It wasn't a recipe so much as a rescue mission, a way of using up the last of a harvest before any of it went entirely to waste. No two pots ever tasted quite the same, because no two nights ever had exactly the same vegetables left to work with. That unpredictability was part of what made it feel less like poverty food and more like resourcefulness. Proof that a woman living alone in these hills could still make something out of almost nothing, right up until the very last carrot was gone. The next few meals move into territory that most people today would find genuinely hard to imagine eating, not because they were unusual, but because of exactly how little they were built from. 26. Salt and pepper. Water cornbread on the hardest nights when even bacon grease had run out. Cornmeal got mixed with nothing but salt, pepper, and boiling water into a thick paste, formed into a small cake, and fried dry in a bare skillet until it crisped at the edges. No egg, no milk, no fat beyond whatever film remained coating the pan from the last thing cooked in it. It was dense, plain, and only just barely satisfying, but it was hot, and it was food, and on a night with truly nothing else in the house, that was the entire measure of success. Older folks who remember eating this as children describe it less as a meal and more as an emergency, the kind of supper that only ever got made when every other option in the kitchen had already run out. That same desperation showed up in a version of gravy made without any meat drippings at all. 27. Flour gravy and biscuits, no sausage, no bacon grease, no meat of any kind. Just flour, browned dry in a hot skillet until it darkened and turned faintly nutty, then thinned with water and a little milk if there was any, seasoned with salt and pepper, and poured over a biscuit. It was thin, plain, and tasted mostly of browned flour, but it was warm, and it was filling in the way that starch alone can fill a stomach, even without much nourishment behind it. This was the gravy made in the leanest stretch of winter, when the smokehouse had run empty and the next hog wouldn't be killed until fall. It fed people. It kept them upright. and it asked almost nothing of a kitchen that, by that point in the season, had almost nothing left to give. There was one more way to stretch a nearly empty pantry, and it came down to nothing but a boiled egg and whatever bread was left. 28. Boiled egg on cornbread. A single egg, boiled hard, sliced thin, and laid across a wedge of cornbread with a little salt and pepper. This was supper, reduced to its barest possible form, one egg doing the work an entire meal usually did. For a woman rationing what few eggs her hens still laid through a hard winter, a single egg spread across a piece of cornbread could be stretched further than that same egg eaten any other way. It was quiet food, private food, the kind of supper nobody described to a neighbor the next day because there wasn't much to describe. There was just an egg, some corn, and a woman at her table, eating alone in a kitchen that had gone. Very still. The last two meals on this list are the ones that people who actually lived through them are the most reluctant to talk about at all. 29. Water gravy over stale bread, when there was no flour left to brown, no milk, and nothing in the pan but the memory of grease long since used up. Some women poured hot water directly over torn pieces of stale bread, added a pinch of salt, and called it supper. It wasn't gravy in any real sense. It was warm salted water softening old bread into something a person could swallow without much effort. There was no nutrition in it worth mentioning, no flavor beyond salt and warmth, and no pretense that it was anything other than what it was. The last thing standing between a woman and an empty table. People who ate this as children, decades later, still describe the exact color of the bowl it came in. That's how deeply this particular meal lodged itself into memory, even though, by any real measure, it was barely a meal at all. And then there's the last one, the one that almost never gets said out loud, even now. 30. An empty table and a glass of buttermilk. Some nights there was no cornbread left to crumble, no beans soaking, no egg in the icebox, and no strength left to make even the simplest of the meals already listed here. On those nights, an elderly woman living alone poured herself a glass of cold buttermilk, sat down at a table set for one, and drank it slowly, because it was the only thing in the house that still counted as food. It wasn't a recipe. It wasn't a tradition passed down through generations. It was simply what was left, at the end of a long stretch of hard winters and harder years, when the garden had given everything it had to give, and there was nothing left to gather, dry, can, or fry. People who remember this, who remember a grandmother or a great-aunt living this way, alone in a mountain house with a stove that had gone cold, don't tell this story often. But they remember it, and in a strange way, it explains every single meal that came before it on this list. Every pot of soup beans, every skillet of cornbread, every jar of chow chow put up in September was a small act of defense against this exact night ever arriving. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. These 30 meals were never written down in any cookbook because nobody making them thought of themselves as a cook worth writing about. They were mathematics, done in a kitchen instead of on paper, how far a dollar could stretch, how long a jar of beans could last, how much a body could get by on when nobody else was coming to check. They were made with hands that had done this same work for 60 years, in kitchens that had gone quieter with every passing decade, by women who never once complained about what was on the plate, because complaining wouldn't have put anything else there. Most of these dishes have all but disappeared now. The gardens that fed them are grown over. The root cellars stand empty. The women who could make cathead biscuits by feel, without ever measuring a thing, are mostly gone. But for a long stretch of years, in a long stretch of hollers, this is what kept people standing. 10 minutes at a time, one plate at a time, one woman at a time, in a kitchen that the rest of the world never saw. That QR code has been sitting in the corner of your screen this whole time. If these 30 suppers found their way into your own memory tonight, that's the last thing I'll ask of you. Scan it and subscribe, so the next set of Forgotten Kitchens doesn't stay forgotten.